Hello everybody, Jake Raby here, Flat 6 Innovations. Well, I want to welcome you back to another RenVision technical video. Now in today's video, we actually are joined by the prior owner of the 29,000 mile 2003 Porsche 996 C2 that featured the IMS bearing failure at 29,000 miles. And I would like to introduce him to you today.
Hi, my name is Pete Sayeski. I'm a retired publisher and I live in Atlanta, Georgia.
So when you were a kid, Pete, what kind of cars did you dream of owning?
Well, when I was growing up in South Georgia, Moultrie, Georgia, to be specific, that was in the day of the old fast Ford products, Chevrolet products. Back in 55 is when the first V8s began to be produced, and so it was sort of a car culture. And I grew up, riding in some of those cars, friends that had those cars, and I just really got to be a car guy. And as my life progressed, I bought first your beginner cars, which were really not much car in those days, good old 6-cylinders. But I began to get more into nice cars, and it progressed. And in my later years, when I had educated my children and I could justify some discretionary spending, I decided to go for the ultimate fast car and to buy a Porsche when in my early 60s. But it was the greatest thing in the world. I think I really, more than anything else, probably liked the sound of it. Mm-hmm. It made that powerful sound, and if I'd had a CD with the sound, I probably would have been okay. But I had to get the Porsche, and I got it, and I loved it. It was a great car, and everything was fine until after owning it for several years. It's 2003. I decided probably it was time to not get in and out of the Porsche and crawl in and out. It's a great car, but I was a little more difficult to maneuver it and drive it. And I really wanted to make sure that it wound up in the right place. So I actually found a buyer, a guy that I knew very well, and I just casually had mentioned to him that I had a Porsche and I was going to probably sell it, and I was really looking for the right buyer because I had several people who wanted to buy it, and I didn't think they were the right buyer, so I wouldn't sell it to them. Mm-hmm. But I found the right guy, and so he drove it, and it was his first. He had the Porsche Dream. It was a dream car for him also, although it was had 29,000 miles on it. It was in mint condition because it had been treated so well over the years. And I was happy that he wanted it, and he was happy that he got it. So it was around New Year's, I guess, just before the Super Bowl. I negotiated a deal, and I met him. I had bought a new Porsche, or a new Mercedes, and I met him at the Mercedes dealer in Athens, Georgia. And he came with his family, and his kids were excited, his wife was excited, and I was happy that he was going to get the car. So the Mercedes people cleaned it up for me, and then he drove away in the Porsche, and I drove away in my new Mercedes. And about, I guess, the weekend after the Super Bowl, this was like just a matter of days, he called and said that the car had stopped running. And I said, "What do you mean it stopped running? This car's in mint condition. It had been every service record, it was all there." He said, "Just stopped." And I said, "Well, okay, fine. Let's find out what happened." So, and then I started sort of delving into what the possibilities could be, and I learned about the IMS bearing problem, which I didn't know anything about. I'd never been notified there was a problem with the engine. And so and the young man who had bought the car was devastated because it was bad. I said, "Don't worry about it." I said, "I'll rip up your check. I'll pick up the car, and it's my car, it's not your car." So then began a very long process of deciding what to do with it, because I really did love the car. I'd found the right buyer, mm-hmm. and now all of a sudden I've got the car back. I own another car, And I had to decide what to do with it. And I thought, well, I'm just going to sell it and salvage it and let that I'll be done. But I found it was very difficult to do because I liked the car so much. So for about a year, I labored about what to do with it. And I started checking around, and that's where one of the calls I made was to Jake Raby to find out what it would cost to rebuild the car. I went into shops in Atlanta where I saw the IMS bearing actually out of an engine. The guy showed to me what happens. And so I did a good bit of research to find out what the problem really was and what it was going to take to fix it. And I really did think, I said, well, I'm just going to, I tried to do a deal where I was going to actually fix it and give it to one of my sons, because at that point I was having difficulty letting it go again. So then I decided, well, no, that really wasn't going to work out at all. So I decided the best thing to do is just to go ahead and let the car go and sell it to somebody who could take it, bring it back to its original life. And so I remember my conversation with Jake Raby about what he would do to it. And that's the conversation that stuck in my head. If I'm going to rebuild this car, it's actually going to be a better car than the one I bought, because it's going to be a bigger engine. It's going to be rebuilt, going to have a few more horsepower, just a little bit larger than it was, and actually would be a more valuable car in a real sense of a Porsche than the one that I actually had. So, it was difficult. It was very difficult to decide which way I was going to go, whether I was going to salvage it or whether I was going to rebuild it myself. So I put it on the Porsche, in the Porsche magazine, and I started getting calls from everywhere. And then I realized that, that the car was very marketable and I could sell it, but I wanted, again, I was back to selling it to the right person. I just didn't want it. And I had one guy who was a FedEx driver, and this was going to be his dream car. And he was trying to work a deal where he would get money from his credit union. And I realized, I said, you really don't want it. You don't want to do this. He was going to try to find somebody who was going to do it on the cheap. And I said, you can't do this car. You'll be very unhappy if you do that.
It would have just failed all over again.
And I told him, I said, if you're going to do that, the guy you need to talk to is Jake Raby. He'll do it right and you'll have a real car. But if you let some friend of yours do it, who just gets the parts, it's not that kind of engine. It's not that kind of car. And I talked him out of it. I said, you really don't want this car. So.
Well, I really, truly commend you for doing what you did with that buyer, because that is a unique scenario. I get calls all the time from people who just bought a car and it failed, even in a shorter period of time than what you have described. And the seller doesn't care. They don't care anything about it, whether it's a dealer, whether it's just a regular used car dealer or any dealer or an individual. It's as is, where is, that's it, and you're done, you're out of luck. And I think in a lot of those cases, people have went in and they've done those quick, cheap patch-ups, like what the FedEx guy was going to end up having done, even though he probably didn't understand he was going to have that done and it was going to cause a problem. They will have that done, and then they'll turn around and sell the car to an unassuming buyer who thinks that it's going to be perfect, and that's going to fill their role as that dream car, and it ends up being that nightmare. So I greatly commend you for that. I just want to make it clear that you purchased this car new.
I did, from a dealer in Ohio. And I drove it very little because it has low miles now. During the winter, I would bring it to Atlanta and it would spend the winter here. Never drove it in inclement weather, never snow, ice, whatever. Always did all the maintenance. Did it with a couple of different dealers where I lived in Ohio, because one was closer to my house than another, but it was all maintained through the warranty period. And after that, I did some dealer, and then I did some European car expert kind of person, but it was always maintained on a regular schedule.
And I could tell that because, you know, yesterday when I was taking things apart, I even showed people, look at the color of this oil, look at the consistency of it. I could tell that there was no discoloration inside the engine. I could tell the oil hadn't set in there for a long time. So it looked like not only did you perform those services at the recommended mileage interval, but you also knew you weren't driving it very much, so you were keeping the time in mind too.
Right.
And a lot of people don't do that. They think, you know, there's cars out there that would have 29,000 miles on them like this one and only see 3 oil changes in 20,000,
yeah,
you know, in all that time.
Mine was done on the time and it was on miles, whichever one was the factor that determined what ought to happen.
And that's the proper thing to do. But all too often, like I said, if you look at the factory service directives for mileage, this car only needed 3 oil changes, 2 or 3 oil changes in the 17 years if you didn't factor the years into it.
Yeah, and I also, we kept it covered in the winter, you know, inside the garage even when we weren't driving it, cranked it up periodically.
Yeah.
But the car itself was in the physical appearance as well as the mechanical was all the same. It was all maintained according to what anybody would do with a car they really wanted to keep for a long time. And I never really intended to sell it. It just sort of grew away from it, but I thought it would be passed down in our family, actually.
Well, and I see that happening a lot where the younger generations, they're just not car people. You know, if it's not some kind of device or a video game, they just don't care anymore.
Yeah, well, my sons, I have 4 children, and my sons actually, we had a couple other, we had a Nissan 300ZX, a turbo, it was a voracious car. But my sons were more careful drivers than my daughters. My daughters were super aggressive and drove too fast and everything that we ever had. And I would never teach them how to drive this car because they were aggressive. But I decided that was the factor really that encouraged me to sell it, because I had some grandchildren who I thought might fall into that same category.
Oh yeah. As far as the 996 specifically, what led you to purchase a 996? Was it just based on the fact that you were retiring and that was the car that was the current generation at that time?
Yeah. I had a friend who had one, and we both were sort of the same age, and I liked his a lot. And I looked at all the options. I wanted the bigger engine, and of course we were comparing, you know, in those days, the horsepower, when they came out with the new models, going up about 25 horsepower. You go from a 300 to 325 to 350, and I was looking for performance, 0 to 60 in under 4 seconds. I was looking at all those factors, and the factors that I was interested in pretty well conformed to what was available in this model of the Carrera. And it was nicely appointed, it had rocker panels and things that if I thought about it a little longer, I might have gone with the 4, I think it was called the Carrera 4, which was all-wheel drive, yeah. But I love the car. Drove it occasionally in the mountains. I mean, it was the right car for me. Did not want a smaller one. I liked the sound. I really did like the sound, and I could switch my mufflers back and forth. And as I said, I probably been just about as happy with the cassette tape of the sound that car would make in a tunnel. I absolutely loved it.
When I'm done with it,
yeah,
that sound is going to be greatly enhanced.
Yeah.
Let's just put it that way, because we're not just building the engine bigger, I'm making it better in a lot of ways, and a lot of these changes change the intake note and things like that. So a lot of what you were hearing wasn't coming out the tailpipe, it was coming through the intake.
Yeah, right.
And when we make this engine do what we do, and I increase the performance like I'm going to, and just to give you an idea, so a car like this one, if you brought it to me in its stone stock form, and I put it on my chassis dyno, which tests the whole car, okay? It takes into account drivetrain losses and things like that. Power at the rear wheels would be about 265 horsepower at the rear wheels for a car like that one. After you've lost to the brakes and the gearbox and oils and all this sort of thing, that's what it makes. And after doing all the IMS jobs, retrofits that we've done, and just fixing cars that were proactively done, I've been able to test hundreds of that generation of car and get that 260 to 270 average power number at the rear wheels. When I'm done with it, it's going to make in the neighborhood of 340 at the rear wheels. Okay,
Wow.
And with a few things that I'm doing to this one, making it my R40 spec, it's probably going to make even more than that. Okay, so we don't really know because every car is different, the dyno's different, all that sort of thing. But you know, even the tires come into the equation, what tires you have and the alignment specs, all that stuff. But that just gives you a basic idea of how much power I'm going to add to it. When you drove the car, now, you never took it to the track or anything like that. You only drove it on the street.
Street car, got it up to maybe 120 or 30 one time in the straightaway, and that was it. I had an experience several years ago where I got on the Autostrada in a BMW 5 Series and averaged about 120, 30 miles an hour driving across the top of Italy, and I decided that was way too fast. But I never got this car. It could have, it wanted to go faster, but I never did try it on a track. Thought about it,
Yeah.
but I'm sort of beyond that.
Well, people a lot of times, and the reason why we've actually structured these questions, and I didn't come up with the questions, Bobby came up with them as an enthusiast, is because people always think in the back of their mind that for this to happen, and this whole engine to have to come apart, and for a guy like me to have to put this all back together again, even to put it back to stock, that you had to do something wrong. You had to abuse it. You had to take it to the track. You had to do something to create this. What would you say to that notion?
You know, you think about those things, and I thought, well, I didn't drive enough, or something like that. But
Yeah.
But what stuck in the back of my mind was, this is a Porsche. This is Porsche, the best engineering in the world in a car you could possibly have, and I didn't understand, why that happened. And the more I got into it, and I know enough about engines, and it's a small, it's not insignificant part, but the actual cost of the part that caused all this damage is minimal compared to the cost of the car.
And that's the thing. The bearing itself is a nickel and dime component.
Right.
But the collateral damage that stems from that, and that's what's in that little blue thing.
Yeah.
See it sitting right there? If you want to grab that.
That's it. I've seen that. It didn't look. Actually, I saw some that looked worse than that. Yeah.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
So that's your little. That's if you want to take that home
I'll
with you,
take
you
that
can.
home, and I would like to take it home.
But that's
yeah.
your collateral damage there. And trust me, that could be a lot worse. I mean, I see these where you'd be taking that stuff back in like a milk crate.
Yeah.
From stuff that was scattered and blown up from the failure.
Well, I had worked on engines all my life, and I just took some old trucks apart, and I spent holidays in junkyards pulling parts off cars to put on other cars. And I knew when bearings go, when they go, they cause all kinds of damage. And I knew in a high-performance engine, the potential, before you got inside, the potential there is just a massive.
And the thing is, you said earlier that you grew up in Moultrie, Georgia, and for people that don't know, that's Farm Country 101. I mean,
Right.
we're sitting on what used to be an old cotton farm here, but Moultrie is still even today the
Right.
ag center of Georgia, and people argue about that being the ag center of the Southeast. So, if you go back to working on hay balers and bush hogs and things like that, which I grew up working on that stuff too, you look at a sealed bearing that would be like an axle bearing on something or a sealed bearing inside of a mower. That's a lot like what this bearing is. And think about what happened when a bearing like that in a mowing deck would go bad. It would usually take the mowing deck out with it, right?
Yeah.
Because the damage, everything's turning so fast, you got all that momentum, mechanical energy stored up in there, things come apart, and that's the same thing that happened with this. And it doesn't matter if it's a tractor or a Porsche engine, it's gonna have the same net effect.
I have a tractor, I just fixed a bush hog that had a bad bearing in it. And I can know my way around. I sort of knew after I went through this whole process what it's actually better than I thought. I thought it really would have been just messed up.
Yeah, and it's only better than what would be expected because the engine was not repeatedly tried to start up again. I think somebody hit the starter maybe one time very lightly and they said something's wrong and they left it alone. But all the people at home, what you need to understand is if you have something you think is a mechanical failure going on in your engine, don't try to start it again, okay? That denial thing, like this just didn't happen to me, that doesn't need to happen to you, right? You need to stop and confirm if you have a problem. Because what that driver did, as the new owner of this car, who'd only owned it for a few days, his actions alone are what created this light intermediate shaft bearing failure that you see here. You know, did the car go to a Porsche dealership to be worked on? Where did it go once it left him?
Well, after the individual called me who had just recently bought it, and I hadn't even changed the title on it, it was still titled in my name, that time frame was so short. I took the car, I had him, we trailered it to Atlanta and took it to a place where they've been doing the service on it. They pulled the pan, found shavings in the oil pan, so that was an indication that it had been an IMS failure. So we, then I said, wow, you know, I started thinking about it, did my research, went online, learned about all the things that happened, learned about the class action lawsuit that Porsche had gotten involved with and settled. And then I actually found your ad, and I believe there was a statement that there were 30,000 bearings sold. And that, to me, I was a businessman. I was able to quickly calculate the number of, that had to be a significant percentage of the number of units Porsche produced in the years this engine failed, which in my mind meant that it was a design failure. It wasn't, you know, it wasn't a quirky thing. It was a design failure. If that many failed, it was more of a recall issue than it was an issue of abuse or something like that, or a class action lawsuit for a settlement. Porsche probably could have spent less money. They probably could have taken the same amount of money they spent on legal fees and paid to have all these IMS bearings replaced, and the dollars to them would have been the same. So I sort of, along those lines, I went back, I said, I'm going back to Porsche with this and see if, you know, I have a low mileage car, totally maintained all the records, you know, can you help me fix this? And
so was that a dealership or was that corporate?
I started with corporate, and what I found out when I went to corporate was that corporate said it's the dealer's responsibility, we don't have anything to do with that. So then I went to a dealer, and the dealer said they couldn't even find a record that I owned the car. And that was that didn't make me feel very good either, because I had all the paperwork. And so we got that straightened out quickly. And then Porsche said, well, you got to get a dealer to fix this. Then I went to, the dealer in Ohio didn't want anything to do with it because I was gone, said I didn't have it serviced there. I said, well, that's not, it's been serviced by Porsche dealers. I have the records. So, and I was in Atlanta now, so I went to a local Atlanta dealer and confirmed that the problem was the same problem they diagnosed at the garage where I was having the car
independent
service.
Garage, yeah.
Right. So they looked at it, and then they made a quote, but they wouldn't guarantee to me if they redid the engine that it would be. They would even replace the bearing with anything but what was already in there, and that could happen again. If it's a defective product, you've already had this class action lawsuit, you know, you're not fixing, you're fixing it, you're making it run again, but you aren't really fixing it. And it could happen again. So I negotiated more with, I called some people, I have some friends at corporate with Porsche, and I talked to them, and it just was too much finger pointing back and forth about who actually was responsible for the car. And having been involved in some large product failures like this myself when I was in business, I realized that they basically weren't going to reopen the class action lawsuit for anybody for anything. As much as they might have liked to have done it, they really weren't going to do it. So then I realized that the remedying the problem was going to be me. It wasn't going to be anything else unless I wanted to spend the rest of my retirement in court. So I decided, then I called Jake, called you, and I was, at that point, I was thinking about doing it, and then I was on it and off it and on and off it. Then I decided it's time to, liberate it.
So after you called me, and this is a question that it's more of a question just for me because I just happen to think about it. It's not on my list. But after you called and talked to me, did you call anybody else that builds these engines as an independent like me? Any other companies?
I went to, I talked to a couple garages in Atlanta that would have done it. And I went in the garage and actually they let me hold the bearing, and I got to learn a lot of things about how to open the trunk through a headlight. I mean, I was into the car then because I'm a car guy, so I was really into it. But I wasn't comfortable, I knew that to do what needed to be done now required, it wasn't just a slapdash, this part, that part. One guy wanted to just get a used engine. I said, that doesn't solve. I'm just buying the same problem.
That's right. Well, sometimes they want to do that based on what they know to do. And there's nothing wrong with that, because I get that from a regular shop's perspective, because, we don't do the whole car. We're just an engine specialist. So not everybody wants to go into engines. Back in the day, the way I remember it as a kid and the way you remember it, people worked on their own stuff, or people, a shop did everything.
Yeah.
You go into a shop and they had a milling machine, they had valve grinders, they had lathes. A shop would build an engine. They could do their own valve jobs. They could do a lot of that sort of thing. Today, the typical automotive repair shop is a parts changer in most cases. There are some exceptions to the rule, but pretty much those are exceptions. Today the rule is parts come in the door, they don't have their own parts in their corner anymore. It comes from a big wholesaler, it has a warehouse down the road, they grab this stuff, they put it in, they go. So sometimes these shops want to do what is only profitable for them and doesn't have your best interests in heart, and I kind of get that, and I think as today, just our whole social world today, people are more about themselves than they are everybody else, and they're more about themselves than they are the customer. So when they tell you just put a used engine in the car, it's because that's what's easy for them to do. And it's what they feel comfortable doing because they don't have all the special tools, they haven't come to my class, they haven't done the things that it takes to take this whole beast apart and put it back together with confidence. And I think that's the difference. But when you did that and you went to those couple of shops, did you call anybody else that was, I refer to them as copycats, people that are kind of ridden on the coattails of us doing this specialty work and tried to create a program like this one? Did you call anybody that just sells engines?
Yeah, I did. But it was what I got was the variance in price to do what I wanted to do was from $15,000 to $25,000. And that's too big of, how do you know which way to go?
Well, and sometimes they play the shell game with you a little bit.
Well,
they got a salesman there that's never built an engine, and I always sell my engines personally because I'm the guy that started the company when I was 13 years old. But, I don't play that shell game, but they'll tell you one price and then, it was worse, and they swap shells.
And see, that's exactly what I realized. It was sort of a shell game. And that I couldn't be, I probably, if I spent $15,000, I was buying the same problem I already had. And because nobody would, they wouldn't elaborate on whether this failure could happen again and what they were selling me. They didn't even know anything about the engines, or whether they'd been driven hard or not hard, maintained. And so it was really, for 15 grand, it was you're just taking a chance.
Well, it's kind of funny, and this is something that you'll get a kick out of, because I tell people a lot of times, when you're calling somebody up and you're asking about an engine, and you guys at home do this, if you're calling somebody asking about one of these engines, whoever you're talking to as a salesperson, say, I've got a question for you. Can you please tell me the 4 strokes of a 4-stroke engine in order? If they can't say intake, compression, power, and exhaust that quick, the guy don't know what you're talking about. How's he going to sell you an engine if you don't know how it works, okay?
Yeah.
My 8-year-old daughter learned that when she was 5, okay? So, but that's something that we see is that these people are salespeople and they don't know what they're selling, so they can't have your best interest at heart because they don't know what they're selling.
I'll tell you how I sort of sorted that out. I would talk to somebody, and then I would go back and do a background check on them. Mm-hmm. And that's when I found out that the $15,000 engine had the person who was trying to sell me that had the background check wasn't good.
Or
it was terrible.
One place has had 3 business names in a year.
Yeah.
You know.
So it was and I realized then if you're going to get it fixed, you got to fix it right. It's going to cost you money to do it. And I did the background check on you as well. And that if I was going to do it, that's where I was going to go. That's why I came back after a year.
Well, and I appreciate that. And that's why I'm glad that we worked this whole thing out and I was able to buy the car. So let me ask you a little bit about your interactivity with other Porsche owners, because Porsches are, the Porsche Club of America is the largest single brand car club in the world. And I greatly value the relationship that PCA has with vendors, and everybody in PCA is great, right? And they're the only company that I'll advertise with at all. Like Panorama, we support that magazine. Were you a PCA member at all?
I wasn't initially, but after the car failed, I never did that. That wasn't on my radar. And I did join afterwards, and that's basically when I tried to sell the car, that was an excellent way to do it. I talked to a lot of people. I'd say 90% of those people you just like to talk to them. They loved the cars, they were into it, they knew what they were talking about. But it was, it's a club. I've got friends. I have one friend who has 7 Porsches. He was in it, a neighbor, and I talked to him about what he did with his cars, and he had old cars, and he and his wife did these time trial where she's the navigator and he's driving, and so the Porsche Club is a good organization, and it was very easy actually to find buyers for this car. I didn't know what I was going to, when I advertised the car, I didn't have any idea what kind of response I was going to get, and I got inundated with responses. That's when I called you, because it's too much. Well,
that's kind of weird that, one, it's really not weird, it's just different that you became a PCA member after you had the failure.
Yeah.
Okay, which says a lot. And secondly, it says a lot more that, even after Bobby told me about the car, when he saw it advertised, I didn't contact you, but the very next day, you contacted me to try to figure out what to do. And I don't really know if you called up to originally offer me the car, but maybe you did that. For whatever reason, I ended up with it. But, when you advertise something for sale, and you've got, I would say 9 out of 10 of the people that saw that car for sale, they were not going to put this kind of an engine back in it. They were going to do it quick. They were going to do it cheap. They were going to try to pull that old bearing out and replace something, and there's one piece in there that would not allow that to happen because it had a further failure. But when you get inundated with stuff like that, I guess sometimes it changes your mind about what you want to do.
Well, one person who was very interested in the car and pursued me like 24/7. When I did some background on him, and I found that all the photos for their dealership or what they were trying to do were stock photos from and I realized then this is not, what I saw was not really who they were. And I became a little suspicious of them. But when I called you, I began to realize there are people who do what you do who might redo an engine, and I realized I had a sort of a unique situation. The car was absolutely excellent, and there are a lot of Porsche dealers' cars or individuals, but this was really a good car, and for the right person, And I really, when I called you, I really wasn't trying to sell you the car, but I was really trying to find out from you who might be interested in the car, or if you knew anybody It wasn't really trying to sell it to you, but then you sort of,
Well, because it's not something I do. I don't buy these cars to fix them
Yeah.
and sell them. You know, it's just because I don't even like to sell my own Porsches. I've currently got 4 air-cooled Porsches over here that I'm going to sell because, you know, I'm so into military vehicles, like you saw my 1942 half-track and some of that stuff. It's what I'm kind of into as a Marine, and it's history to me. But I've got these other cars that I'm selling, and I don't even want to sell them because I don't want to go through the hassles or the problems where somebody has an over-expectation because it's a car that I own. They want it just because they think it's going to be perfect. And that's not the case. I drive my stuff. I use it as it should be intended. So for me to buy a car like this is not the norm. It's not something that I do. You know, it's just not me. I don't do stuff like that. Sometimes I buy and sell military vehicles, but that's a different world. You know.
I've probably owned 15 or 20 new cars, and all the way from low end to high end. I probably only sold 4 or 5 of those cars in my lifetime. I give the rest away to family or to my children. I mean, I get really in. I keep cars. I'm a long-term holder in cars. I don't generally get new cars.
Well, I've got cars. My dad had a '54 Chevy pickup that he bought new when he got out of Korea. I've still got it.
Yeah.
I've got a 1973 Volkswagen Thing that I came home from the hospital in as an infant. 19 years after a restoration period, I've still got it. So, you know, I'm kind of the same way. So, you know, I think that even says more about your deliberation about what to do because, you know, and people at home, you know, sometimes you got to let go of it because there's other factors that come into it. And I know what you were talking about before when you were looking at your parts earlier here, and you talked about that WIFE factor, you know, the wife factor and how that plays into things. And I have guys all the time that say, well, you know, if my wife would let me do this or my wife would let me do that. And I'm like, well, I guess I'm a really lucky guy because my wife has 4 land speed records set in a 996.
Oh, wow.
It was a 99, and the car is almost exactly like the car that I bought from you. And ironically, I bought that car blown up way long years ago, and I fixed it, and she set 4 land speed records in it.
Yeah.
And sometimes I'll ask my wife, you know, I'm like, yeah, I want to buy this half-track. I don't really know if I want to get it or not. She goes, buy it. Okay. I kind of look to her to be that voice that tells me don't do it, but then she tells me to go buy it. So it's a different world. But the wife factor and family factors and today coronavirus factors and all this, you know, that plays into this stuff. Sometimes the guys really want to keep the car, but they can't feasibly do it without taking away from family.
Yeah, well, you know, I have, you know, a big truck. I have a car. I've got a new Mercedes I just bought a couple years ago. I got a big tractor on my farm. And now I'm looking at a forestry piece of equipment that'll grind up trees, mulch trees. So
those aren't cheap. One of those flail mower things.
They're a Porsche.
Oh yeah, trust me. I had a friend of mine come back and do my property here, and it's wonderful.
Yeah, they're fantastic machines. I mean, it's all about, and I mean, you'd love them because it's the later version of that. All the things that machine will do are just unbelievable. But that's where the wife factor, because you got all these. How many more of these things do we need?
Exactly. I want to ask you, if you had it to do all over again, after you see what you see here, would you fix the car, have me do what I'm doing, or would you sell the car to me the way that you did?
Yeah. That's a tough question. After seeing the engine, in realizing that it wasn't major catastrophic, that was serious, I might have tried to fix it, but still, it doesn't really change anything. The engine still is.
Because the problem is we would have had to commit to get into it to find out that it was a better case.
You couldn't have shown me inside the engine to know what was there. I tried every way I could by looking at the amount of metal I kept the metal that came out of the oil pan. I was trying to figure out exactly the question.
And we did that too. You saw these other videos, the first 3. We did our own due diligence to determine if that diagnosis of a bad IMS bearing was the case. And we determined that it was, but you had already kind of been there and pulled some of the clues out.
But it would have been just a guess. I mean, if I had known the damage was that light, it probably could have been fixed. Well, you tell me, it could have been fixed for less than your normal. I mean, it could have been.
No, it was. Well, to me, it would have still been. It would have been my lower end cost. Okay,
Yeah.
It would have been the base price because of the extent of collateral damage. But the thing is, a lot of things I throw away whether they're good or bad. Because I don't want to replace, I don't want to keep just the stuff that I know is still weak in the engine. So to me, this was still going to be, well, and I'll tell you now.
Philosophically, I knew that because of the story I told you about working on a motor and putting parts in a motor and it would run. That's all it would do. And I know you just can't do that.
And see, people a lot of times, as we come into an age where people are not mechanical people, they didn't grow up on a farm, their dad didn't teach them about things, stuff like that. And they don't understand how an engine works. So that term rebuild, they just look at that term rebuild like it means everything, but it doesn't. If you go look at the standards set forth by the Automotive Engine Rebuilders Association here in the United States, if you look at that and you look at those, the least amount of standards, those minimum standards, almost everybody that builds these engines that I know of wouldn't even conform to the lowest amount. Because of the things that they're continually redoing and reusing, and they're not going the full length.
See, in my head, what I thought was a possibility was to buy the block with all the peripherals off of it. The pistons are in, the rings are in, and that's been rebuilt. But you don't even really know how that's been done.
No, and see, that'd be the world if this was a small block Chevy.
Yeah,
you could do
exactly.
that. It's cookie cutter. You can go down to O'Reilly Auto Parts, you can buy an engine rebuild kit, you have the block punched out, and you go back together with it.
I talked to guys about putting sleeves in, and I realized then that if I really, and this is a tantalizing thing because I went through all that. But then I did come up with, if I'm going to redo this thing, I'd rather have it do what you're going to do with it, which is really rebuilt. It's more.
I call it
it's
reconstructed.
Not a stock car
I call it reconstructed because we throw away the good stuff that's good today, that's weak, that we know can cause a problem later, and then we throw away all the bad stuff, obviously too. But the other thing that goes into that consideration is that collateral damage, and this is the problem. I don't like to work from a best case scenario with any of these failures. Like if you remember when I talked to you, I said we have to look at this like it's all in, it's a worst case scenario, you're gonna have extensive collateral damage, because at that time you had told me you had sold the car, and I forgot all about that, but a year and a half ago, you told me you'd sold the car, so I'm sitting here thinking, okay, the guy sold it to,
I hadn't sold it. Well, I did. Yeah,
you had sold it, but when you told me that somebody else had the failure, I automatically start thinking they've done everything wrong as far as trying to restart it and all that. Maybe it really wasn't the way it was said. Maybe they were going 80 miles an hour when it came apart. So that's why I tell you, look, we have to look at this like it's all the way. It's a worst case scenario. Yeah. You have extensive collateral damage.
And I totally understood all that. I mean, that's it.
But most people don't work like that. Like with me, because I guess because I'm a Marine that worked on helicopters, right? Yeah. You always look at things like everything is going to fall out of the sky.
Yeah.
And it's the worst case scenario, it's going to crash and burn. And that's the way I look at this. But it sets me up for success with business because I look at it like that. And I try to set that standard where there's not a whole lot. I'm not selling you a stripped down model, playing that shell game till you end up spending double the amount of money. But so again, do you think that you would have kept the car knowing what you know now, or you would have sold it to me? What do you think?
That's I don't know. I really don't know. I might have flipped a coin. I really did. I mean,
because some people will give up on the car once we see how bad it is. Sometimes they don't want to commit to a proposal, and I get that. And they'll say, look, I want to send it in to you, have you take it apart, let you look at it, tell me how bad it's going to be. And I'm like, okay, that's fine, but you're not getting on my build list. I'm not giving you a slot until you commit. And it might take me a month or so to get the engine apart because we've got a year backlog. So, you know, as long as time's no consideration.
If I'd gone that route, I would have done exactly what you're going to do. It would have been a full rebuild.
And that's what I thought you would say. And knowing what I know about these engines, that's the same case. Now, if you were the kind of guy that had one of these extensive failures where you had a whole bucket full of parts, and it took the crankshaft out, and it took out the carrier, and it took out the block, and you know those are extreme things for an IMS bearing failure, but they can happen if somebody continues to operate it. Then it would be a little bit different story because sometimes that can add $5,000-$8,000.
Well, the block is basically a good block, pretty much, I guess.
Oh, the block's perfect. I mean, it doesn't have bore scoring yet. It has a couple of pistons that have lost their skirt coating that I showed you earlier, but the block is in excellent condition. All this stuff will look brand new when we do what we're going to do. We're going to ultrasonically clean everything. We're going to send the block to LN Engineering to have the Meticulous sleeves put in it because I developed that procedure along with them back in the late 90s. You know, so it's going to end up looking a lot different. But we're going to reuse the cylinder heads and put different valves in them, and we're going to port them, and we're going to do all kinds of cool stuff that you learned about back in the 50s.
Right.
I tend to merge that classic hot rodding along with modern thoughts and modern components and processes. So, you know, while a lot of people just want to swap another engine into the car, I want to take it apart, make it my way, build it by hand with one set of hands and one mind doing the work, and put it back together again. So something interesting I want to show you. If you look at that crankshaft carrier right there, you notice there's some little hash marks going across those bearings. This engine was such low mileage that those hash marks are actually the marks created by the precision measuring device that set the running clearance at the factory. So it didn't even have enough wear on those bearings to even get rid of the marks created by the measuring procedure during manufacturing.
See, that's how the car was maintained. I mean, that was the car.
Once that block comes back from LN having their magic done, then I'm going to start documenting all the processes of assembling the engine with photographs and more video in this series, okay? So I want to certainly thank you for watching this focus on IMS bearing failure, which is another technical video brought to you by RenVision. I'm Jake Raby from Flat 6 Innovations, and we'll see you next time. Hello everybody, Jake Raby here. Now I'd like to welcome you to the RenVision technical channel here on YouTube. And on this channel, you'll learn about all kinds of things. You'll learn about everything from Porsche engines to vintage Volkswagens, other stuff about vintage Volkswagens, not just the engines. You'll learn about things like this 1942 M2A1 half-track as an example. So once again, I want to thank you for viewing all the content here on RenVision. I want to invite you to spend more time with us. I want to bring you into my world. I want to help you understand a little bit more about what makes us tick, what we do, how we do it, and why. So certainly join us and let's have some fun together.